As we begin Unit 2, we're going to be looking at global marketing, and global marketing is a very exciting area. I kind of got into the whole field of global marketing, and you have maybe gathered already, I spend a lot of time in Asia, particularly China. Take usually 2 classes a year, San Diego State classes to China, and teach them a San Diego State class there. Usually teach once in Shanghai and once in Beijing to Chinese students. I spend a fair amount of time in Thailand and some in France and Germany and Italy as well. But I have to tell you as I start all of this that I'm very jealous of all of you because in many ways you have opportunities I didn't have. When I finished college, which obviously is a very long time ago, I was very well trained to sell white bread to white people in Iowa. And that was about it. And that was kind of boring after 6 weeks or so. I kind of fell into the world of global marketing by accident. You know, you plan and plan and plan your life and career, and then there's a brief deviation. And I've never been unhappy about it. It's a lot more complicated. It's always changing. Global markets are continually changing. A new election in any one country has sort of a ripple effect everywhere. And I'm not just talking about in the United States, but even sometimes very small countries. So as we look at global marketing and think about the fact that at this point in time, there are just about 7.4 billion people on the planet. That's a lot of people. The United States has 323 million people. It's slightly less than 5% of the world population. I want you to kind of remember, hold a couple of these facts in your head. Another fact that we need to know is what the gross world product is. This is a term that I'm not sure all of you have ever encountered. You have certainly encountered gross domestic product, as we see down here for American GDP, but maybe you've never heard of gross world product. It is the aggregate of all 210-ish countries, however many countries we have, the actual number sometimes changes. If we took the GDP of all those 210 countries and aggregated it, so it's the total flow of goods and services in the world, and that's about $78 trillion. Now, the United States GDP is 18.5 trillion, which makes it 23+% of gross world product. If you look at this number, 23.6% and 4.5%, I want you to really think about that. We're less than a 20th of the world's population, but we consume more than a fifth of the world's goods and services. We add in a couple of other factors to this whole scenario, and we have to ask the question, are we in the United States hogs? Do we disproportionately consume? I think most of us would have a hard time saying, even to some degree, maybe we are a little bit hoggish. But think about this. At this point in time, 24% of the world's population lives in a DC. A DC is not my abbreviation. That's a United Nations World Bank abbreviation. 24% of the world's population lives in a developed economy, which means 76% does not. Now, here's where you can tell if you are truly a business major or not. Because if you're a business major, you look at those numbers, what America's share of gross world product is, what America's share of the population is, and what percentage of the world is not yet developed. And if you're truly a business major and look at this as a tremendous opportunity to spread markets and spread products around the world, you look at it and kind of go, whoa, we get to sell them all the products and services as they catch up to where we are. For instance, just think about when China is 1/4 as economically developed as the United States. India is 1/5 as economically developed as the United States. How many more goods and services will be being sold? Now, I am not in any way, shape, or form saying that I ever think that if America is about a fifth of the world's population, it will only consume a fifth of the world's goods and services. No, we're all too much of a pig for that. We are too accustomed to our fairly comfortable life. But do I project a time when it could be that America consumes 10 to 12% of the world's goods and services? Yes. That will be when the rest of the world's economy catches up And again, you all have the opportunity to make that happen. So, given that, let's talk about why there has been such a phenomenal growth in the global economy. And this list of five, which we'll go through in a lot of detail, is not an exhaustive list, but it's five factors that really have changed the way in which the global economy works. If I were teaching you this class in, say, the 1970s, I'd probably look a lot better. I'd probably look younger than most of you and wouldn't know very much. But if I were teaching you 40 years ago, the world was a very different place, and the global economy was a lot smaller in a lot of different ways. There weren't as many markets open. That's the first one. There weren't as many regional markets. There weren't as many saturated domestic markets in the DCs. We didn't have the electronics for finance and travel and communication and markets to interact. And the last one we'll kind of hold in reserve as we get to that one. So the first issue has to do with the fact that 30 years ago, even perhaps, if we go back 30 years, there still were a lot of economies that were closed. They were not open for trading. The United States companies simply could not do business with them. And there's a couple of different reasons. There's two major reasons that cover several of the really big economies. First of all, World Trade Organization has become a pretty powerful entity around the world. And one of the things that has happened is increasingly, in order to become a member of WTO, a country is not supposed to use tariffs. But that doesn't mean that sometimes they don't protect their own markets, including the United States. Sometimes we're pretty devious about this as well. What has come to happen is that many of these countries will use what we call an NTB, a non-tariff barrier. And a non-tariff barrier simply means that we don't put a duty or a tax on everything that comes into the country from a foreign country, but we get creative about how we restrict the total amount that they can sell. I'll give you a quick example here, and this would go back to the 1980s, maybe late 80s, early 1990s. It was the age of minivans. Soccer moms loved minivans. It was before SUVs. And at that point in time, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler made pretty bad cars. The big three in Detroit, they didn't really care about quality so much. That has changed a lot. The cars that were really, really well made, reasonably priced, and that a lot of soccer moms made tended to be Japanese minivans. Toyota in particular, Honda, a couple of the others as well. They could have sold a lot of minivans. But the guys in Detroit, rather than making American cars better and competing at that point in time with the Japanese cars, went to Washington, got Congress to pass quotas. And they said, okay, we're going to restrict the number of minivans that the Japanese can import. That's a non-tariff barrier. And they set the quota at 100,000 a year for all of the manufacturers. I think at the time it was about 2 to 3 million that they could have easily sold. So this put a real clamp on what the Japanese manufacturers could do. Japanese manufacturers had to face the fact that the only way they were going to be able to do business with America and sell these minivans and others of their vehicles in the United States was to move to the United States and build factories. And while the Japanese like to travel abroad, they actually don't like to work abroad. It is a very unusual culture. Japanese people like to live in Japan. They like to stay at home in Japan. They're very comfortable in Japan. But starting with Toyota and Honda, they realized they had to build factories, and build them they did. There's quite a few. I think in the last few years, Toyota has been one of the largest exporters of automobiles out of the United States. They did not locate most of their factories in Detroit. They put them in the South, generally in free trade states where they did not have to work with the big labor unions that you have to deal with in Detroit. By the way, it took them several years, of course, to get factories built and everything established. It's not the easiest thing to build an automobile factory, particularly in another country. The Japanese had to figure something out in the interim. It was not a sustainable solution, but it worked for the time. They got very clever. And I want you guys to start thinking out of the box. They realized that commercial vans, a van like you would put flowers in, you put dry cleaning in and deliver products, they actually went down the same assembly line, and probably 85-90% of the vehicle was identical to a minivan. It was mostly the interior that was different. So what the Japanese companies would do, Toyota would have a ship land in Long Beach, and it would have all these cars being driven off the gangplank, and the car would be numbered. It would be, I don't know, number 476. There'd be a sort of a paired ship arriving at another dock, and off that was coming a big crate that would say number 476. And they'd put the crate, they'd drive it off, they'd offload the crate, stick it inside the minivan, the commercial van. They would drive it to a place about 30 miles outside of Long Beach, and they would open the crate, and in it were all the interior things that went in the commercial van to make it a minivan. Because there was no limit, there was no quota on how many commercial vans could come in. So it worked for a while. Let me give you a couple of other non-tariff barriers, ways that companies are often very clever at keeping companies from exporting products into their country, and maybe just not having that product in their country, or at least making them come to the country in order to do business, to actually establish the business there. And one of them has to do with the fact that many countries will have very ambiguous standards. They won't tell you what the requirements are. They'll just tell you once you get the product there, no, that's not right. Sometimes the standards will vary. Well, no, it has to be bigger. Well, no, it has to smell like this. Well, no, it has to weigh this much, whatever. Two countries, two big markets that have been very, very strong users of standard ambiguity are Japan and Brazil. And I'll give you an example here. This comes from one of our former IB students, who was originally from Washington State, and came to San Diego State, studied international business with Japanese as his language. He went, upon graduation, off to Japan to teach English, which, by the way, if you ever want to go to another country and learn to do business in that country and get connections, think about going to teach English. You can't go to England and do it. You can't go to someplace like South Africa or Australia. But there are a lot of countries in the world, Republic of South Korea, China, Indonesia, they're always looking for English teachers. You won't get rich, but you also will live okay. They will get you your work permit. You will have friends. And when you think about who you're teaching the people who are kind of more socially active, involved in the business community, want to learn business, learn English usually in order to do business. You start to get the right connections. So Jonathan went off to Japan, speaking pretty good Japanese, although you don't have to speak the language of the host country particularly well to teach English. He went off to Japan and was very successful there, came home after the first year or so at Christmas to Washington State, which is when Starbucks was beginning to expand all over the place. And Jonathan looked at these great big, sort of Washington State lumberjacks coming out of having just chopped down a whole bunch of trees. And there's a cappuccino cart at the gate, and they're saying, "I'll have a latte. I'll have a cappuccino." And he looked at it and said, wow, the Japanese would love this. And the Japanese were not yet really coffee drinkers in a very big way. It came kind of slow. They're a nation of tea drinkers. So Jonathan decides he's going to start with some cappuccino carts. And the first thing he started doing was bringing in the equipment to make it. The first thing he brings in is the cups. 4 times the customs agents would say, "Nope, that's not the right cup. It's too big, it's too short, it's too small, it's too flat." And he would say, "Well, what is the standard?" And they say, "We don't know. We don't have cappuccino cups." Finally, on the 5th one, they acquiesced and they said, "Okay, that will work." He had resolved that issue and they said, "Okay, that's the wrong cappuccino machine." And he said, "But we don't have any cappuccino machines in Japan." And you have to understand that often the customs people will do this. They'll do something we call jawboning, trying to wear you down as they steal your ideas of what's coming into the country. Jonathan, however, persisted because he did have connections in Japan by that point in time. And about maybe 15 years ago, he had somewhere in the order of 10 coffee shops that were very successful, no longer just cappuccino carts, on the southern island in Japan. And this company that many of you may be familiar with came in and said, can we make you an offer you can't refuse? And he didn't refuse it. And he's probably living very well somewhere now. So you sometimes have to deal with these ambiguous rules and regulations. Another one that may be a little bit surprising to you and gives me an opportunity to talk about Coca-Cola, because this is the one brief interlude in all of Coca-Cola's history where they actually sold something other than non-alcoholic beverages. Between 1982 and 1987, Coca-Cola owned Columbia Pictures. Now, for a company that only ever made non-alcoholic beverages, this is kind of funny, and it was rather puzzling to most people. Why would you buy a movie company? That's quite, I mean, talk about diversification. Coke's answer was, well, you know, watch a movie, drink a Coke. Well, my answer is, do anything and drink a Coke. Good time for a sip. But the real reason they did this was because Coca-Cola was in so many countries, probably close to 190 countries at the time. Many of them had really strict repatriation rules. Repatriation rules mean you might make $10 million, but they're only going to let you bring $500,000 a year home. Well, that works at first when you're trying to build the business in that country, when you're in Brazil or Ecuador or Morocco or wherever the heck you are. But there's a point at which you've built a business in the host country, and the stockholders want the money to come home. So Coca-Cola decided to buy Columbia Pictures for two reasons. One, this was a way to get the money out of the country. And number two, it matched pretty well with what was the trend in movies at the time. A lot of the movies were goofy movies like Romancing the Stone, Jewel of the Nile, those kind of crazy movies. And they were filmed on location. So what Coca-Cola would do is they would take the money they'd made from Coca-Cola, let's say in Morocco. They would fly one actor, one actress, one director, maybe one assistant to Morocco. Everybody else working on the film, all the other actors, all the cameramen, all the key grips, the costumers, the caterers, everybody. They were all Moroccan. They all got paid with the money that Coke had made on the bottling of Coca-Cola in Morocco. Then when the movie was all finished, the director would get on the plane carrying a couple of big canisters of film. In those days, the movies weren't digital, they were still filmed. And so he would be going through customs and he might have 7, 8 huge canisters of film. The customs agents would say to them, what's the film worth? It's worth $5,000 maybe, because that's the actual cost of the film. That's what it was worth until they walked into the editing room in Hollywood and they edited the film and then sent it around the world and made a ton of money on that movie. Coca-Cola owned Columbia for about 5 years. In 1987, they sold it to Sony, and Sony to this day still owns Columbia. Two things happened. One, the trend in on-location movies kind of switched out, and so it didn't make as much sense. The second thing is Coca-Cola just realized the entertainment industry is such a disgusting industry in which to operate and was not the way the fine gentlemen and ladies from Atlanta were used to operating, so they sold it. However, if you ever see a movie that is a Columbia Pictures movie made between 82 and 87, watch and see how many times there are sometimes really crazy Coca-Cola product placements in the movie. You'll see Cherry Coke and Diet Cherry Coke. And I mean, it's just kind of comical how they came to fit their product in. The second thing, however, has to do with, in terms of the more protectionist countries opening up, is that in many cases, we had a lot of communist nations. Before 1987, the Soviet Union, which was a huge country, it was at that point in time the third largest population. Certainly, the People's Republic of China, the largest country in the world and the largest communist country in the world. These were all completely closed. We could not trade with the Soviet Union. We could not trade with the People's Republic of China. No one is quite sure exactly what happens. We often, in global marketing and management, joke about the stars of global marketing aligned somewhere between 1987, first in China, 1989, Germany, 1991, the Soviet Union coming undone, and India kind of opening up. But things changed. And the first one was that a lot of the communist countries were realizing this is actually not really working. In 1990, again, you had the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Cuba, and North Korea as communist nations. Today, in 2016, we still have North Korea as a communist nation, a very scary communist nation. It's only a population of about 17 million and not a great market at this point because it's an extremely poor country. Even Cuba has now opened up somewhat. It is still officially communist. Venezuela has become communist. And the People's Republic of China, this is the PRC, this is Nanjing Shilu in Shanghai on a Saturday in summer, a pedestrian walkway. This may not be what you expect a communist nation to look like. Yes, it has the Chinese flag everywhere up and down the street, but there's probably few countries in the world that are more commercially motivated. Culturally, the Chinese have, if you slit your wrist, took a blood test, pricked their finger and took a blood test, I swear, I believe they have a gene on how to make money. Chinese are merchants. And when the Soviet Union came undone, and so politically and economically, it was all changed all at once, the People's Republic of China said, we think we can hold together the political part if we start to and increasingly give more freedom in the economy. And that's exactly what they did. To this day, China is still a very seriously communist nation controlled by the powers that be in the People's Party in Beijing. Every time I'm in China teaching, particularly a Chinese class, a little bit less if I'm teaching a San Diego State class, but if I'm teaching a Chinese class, there's always a spy in my class. There are certain things I can't say. I can't say the D word, democracy. But I can teach them all about making money. That's perfectly okay. So this market of more than 1.3 billion and growing has opened up. The other thing is there were several countries, Brazil, India, etc., that were very protectionistic. And I give you India as an example because India is the second largest population in the world. It's a huge country that was completely closed from the time it got its independence in 1947. Having been controlled by the British as a colony from the mid-1700s to 1947, being a big country with a lot of well-educated people. There are also a very large number of very poor, very poorly educated or non-educated people in India, but there's also a very, very well-educated elite in India. And from 1947 on, they simply said, we don't want to trade with the West. We're tired of dealing with the Brits. We're tired of dealing with having been colonized. We'll just do our own thing. And then a lot of their prime ministers, a lot of their finance ministers were sent to Britain. They were sent to Australia. They were sent to the United States to study. And they began to realize how far behind economically India was. Beginning in 1991, they started to open their markets. And if you saw the movie Slumdog Millionaire, which was actually a pretty good movie, a pretty good insight into what India was, and it has improved. It is still a difficult country. This is what Bombay used to look like in probably about 1990, 1989. It is really horrible. There are still a lot of problems in Mumbai. That's the new name for Bombay. But it is a much more advanced city, as you can see, and one that has got tremendous growth in many ways. Huge middle class, growing middle class in India. Lots and lots of business and lots of trade through outsourcing, as we have talked about with even the legal profession. And so finally, India said, you know what, we are really behind. The only major market, and this is funny because most of you don't even know this is a significant market, the only major market that India dominated was for tuk-tuks. This is a tuk-tuk. If you've been anywhere in Southeast Asia, you've probably seen a tuk-tuk. These are, I don't know, they must have like the tiniest little engine and they kind of spit and sputter and you crawl into them, and they're vehicles, taxis. Sometimes there's 15 people in them. I've seen them double-decker tuk-tuks that you have to climb up onto. Three-wheelers, not incredibly safe. That was the only market that they were dominating. So companies like Tata, very big successful company in India, and Bajaj, these are companies that started opening up saying, we need to embrace foreign technology and open up. They now are equal trading partners with all the rest of us in the West. So you have a lot of change in terms of the fact that many of those markets that previously were closed are now open. And the number of markets that are still closed are very, very few. Venezuela, North Korea, and again, even Cuba is somewhat open. The second thing that changed this is the occurrence of a regional market and then the success of regional markets. And a regional market organization is a kind of vague thing in a way. We categorize them, but there's no strict adherence to what those categories are. And this is, when we look at the success of regional markets, what we're talking about is when a couple of countries who usually are neighbors, they're not always neighbors, but usually are neighbors, come together and say, we're small or we're lacking certain resources, but if we come together and work together as a cooperative agreement economically, we actually become a much more viable force in the global economy. So as I say to you, there are a lot of different arrangements with very different degrees of interactions. That really is the case. There are very different degrees of interactions. And sometimes a group of countries will call themselves a common market, and they're really not quite a common market, but there's no direct, global market, regional market police going around and saying that's not true. It all started in 1957 with the common market in Europe. And this actually is pretty significant if you think about it, because this is just 12 years after the end of World War II. France and the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, very small countries, but very intelligent countries, very productive countries. France has some really good resources. They were on the Allied side. West Germany, or Germany, and Italy during World War II were in the Axis side. These countries were actually 12 years previously mortal enemies, trying just to kill each other, trying just to conquer each other. But they realized as they were watching Japan rebuild itself, that Japan was a much bigger country and a much bigger market. And as America was growing and growing, there was no way they could compete in the world market unless they banded together. So the first part of the European common market was those 6 countries. Now let's take a look at these, and we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up. Basically, there's kind of 5 levels. And again, the categorization is kind of vague and kind of swishy, but I'll give you some examples of what each one is. Starting with the bottom level, we have a cooperative agreement. Cooperative agreement is a very loose arrangement between the participating countries. Basically, what they do, they give each other most favored nation status, MFN. The best example I can give you is ASEAN, and that's not a typo. Okay, it's actually the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It started with about 6 countries. Today it's probably about 17 or 18 countries. Does not include China. They're too big, they don't need it. Does not include India. They're too big, they don't need it. Does not include Japan. Everybody remembers Japan in World War II in Southeast Asia, and they won't allow them in. At the next level, we have a little bit tighter arrangement, and we have a free trade agreement. And the basic premise of a free trade agreement is that the countries involved, like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, United States, Canada, and Mexico since 1991 or 93, we can move products across borders without any problem. So we can make products in Mexico, where the labor rate is a lot cheaper, and when those products are finished, just move them across the border to the United States or Canada and sell them at a much better profit. This is great for America, the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It's also a good deal for countries like South Korea and Japan, who will manufacture the parts at home so that they have control over the quality. They ship them to the Baja typically, or somewhere along the 50-mile range along the southern United States border. They'll make them they'll have them assembled in factories there. There's not a television set made in America anymore. They're all made in Mexico. Whether it's an American, a European, a Japanese, or a Korean company, they're all made in Mexico and they're shipped across the border. So the free trade agreement does not allow you to move money easily and does not allow you to move people freely, but it does allow you to move products. When you get to the next level, a common market, like the EU started as a common market, as we spoke about, or a customs union, and there's a slight difference there, but for our intents and purposes, they're pretty similar. Basically, what you can now do is you can move money and products pretty freely across borders. People, not so easily, but you can move goods and money across, so you can optimize markets and make it in the most productive country. And the best example I can give you of a fairly successful, not perfect, but a fairly successful common market is Mercosur. Mercosur, which is Mercado market in Spanish, Sur South, started as the four green countries, Brazil and Argentina, who hated each other, still hate each other, but knew that they complemented each other. Added in Paraguay and Uruguay, okay, to a large extent, not only, but to a large extent because of the Orinoco River in here that is great for shipping and great for the ports. It was so successful that virtually everyone else, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia, have become associate states and will be fully, basically they're kind of all treated the same. The only countries not Mercosur states or countries are the three Guianas, French, British, and Dutch Guiana. I think total there's probably 250,000 people there. They are minute countries. Kind of not, it's not economically worth their value to be part of that. At the next level, we have an economic union, and this is what the common market eventually became. What happens here is now you can move money, products, and people across borders. So that, for instance, if you're a member of the European Union, and you are French, you get a passport that says basically you're a French citizen, but you have an EU passport and you can go to any of those countries freely. Okay, you can move back and forth. This makes it really optimal when a country is, or a company is producing in one country and maybe they have better labor, they have more skilled labor to do a particular thing in one country. Maybe they want to move things across the border. This is actually, to a large extent, how companies like H&M and Zara, both clothing companies, have become so incredibly successful. They optimize the location, they optimize the labor, they optimize everything by moving across the borders. And these are the countries of the EU. Of course, as of summer of 2016, the United Kingdom voted to exit, the Brexit, from the EU, but it will take a while. At the highest level, there is something called the political union, where you have everything that you had below. Okay, so we have uniform, I mean, we have individual states like we had in the USSR. The Soviet Union used to be not just these, but there were a couple in other places along the western border, but mostly these 15 countries were all under the jurisdiction of the Soviet Union, under the orders of Moscow. They had one common language. Didn't mean they didn't speak their own language in, let's say, Kazakhstan or the Ukraine or somewhere else. But they all used the same currency. They could move goods and services, people across borders. The Soviet Union came undone in 1991, so actually we don't really have a political union that we can give you as an example, except maybe us. We don't really think of ourselves as a political union, and yet we are. One common currency, but we've been this way since 1776. Basically one common language. We can, even an immigrant who's legal can land in Kentucky and without any problem can cross the border into any other state, can take with them currency from one, the American currency from one state to another. So that's a political union. All of these regional markets have made it so much easier to deal with countries. Because just think about, if I invented a product and I decided that Luxembourg, you cannot even see Luxembourg, it's right here, a tiny little thing, less than 1 million people. If I decided that Luxembourg was the perfect market for me to launch that product, but there aren't 1 million people in that country. Before Luxembourg was part of the EU, I would have looked at it and said, it's not worth it. But when I look at Luxembourg and say, okay, this is where I want to start, but then I'm going to spread out to all these other countries, I'm looking at almost 500 million people. Okay, it is a huge, huge market with all the same rules and regulations. It has made doing business in these integrated market, regional markets much, much more successful. The third thing that has spurred global growth is the fact that in the developed countries, we have saturated markets. And maybe you remember when we talked about growth options, and I tried to explain to you about what it means to be saturated. It means that that market is holding every single product, every single consumer that it could hold. If I added another one in through the top, one would fall out the bottom. It just would kind of go away, and I would cannibalize. Well, many of our markets are saturated. The DCs, and one of the characteristics of a developed country, not the only one, but one, is that these are countries where the GDP per capita is greater than 10,000. That's not average income. Remember, again, that's taking total goods and services, dividing it by the number of people in the country. And by the way, this might surprise you, that number hasn't changed since I was in school. The numbers are actually very classic numbers. They're very pivotal numbers. Many companies look at countries and they look to see when they hit 2,500 GDP per capita, when they hit 5,000 GDP per capita, when they hit 7,500. Lots of things start to kick into place. And so the developed countries have a problem. They have a lot of markets that they really can't sell anymore. They would just be cannibalizing. The developed countries tend to be identified as the triad. You have the European countries, which is about 55% of all the developed economy population. You have Canada and the United States, which is about 35%, and you have Japan and the Republic of South Korea. We could probably also add in to this Asian portion, we could add in Singapore, which is about 6 million people, a city-state, incredibly productive, and Hong Kong, which is about 9 or 10 million, also a city-state, but which is now a special administrative region of China. So let's think about how many of you wake up in the morning and decide that you need a new refrigerator. If your refrigerator is not broken, if you're not getting divorced, as we've talked about, and if you're not renovating your kitchen. In other words, you have to start looking to the NICs. You have to start looking at the newly industrializing countries. And again, they're referred to as NICs. NICs are countries whose GDP per capita tends to run $2,500 to $10,000 per year. And when we're looking at those countries, and those are often really, really good countries to look at, we think, well, I can't sell a lot more refrigerators to Americans. I can't sell a lot more refrigerators to French consumers. If they have a refrigerator, they're going to wait till theirs dies to buy a new one. It's not like shoes. You don't go, oh, I have to have those shoes. You wait. But how many refrigerators can I sell in the newly industrializing countries? A lot. So we look at this and think, where is my growth potential? The McDonald's looks at the world and says, and at present there's somewhere around 38,000 McDonald's stores. If you look at this map, the size of the circle sort of tells you how many restaurants they have. You can see that France is big, Canada's relatively big, Brazil's pretty big, Japan is pretty big, China's getting bigger. The big one is Japan there, and China underneath it, but getting bigger. A company like McDonald's, and I really do admire McDonald's on this dimension. They have a very sophisticated location model. In the United States, it's basically one store for every 27,000 people. Now, they adjust for traffic and location and things like that. And if you take the population of the United States, divide it by about 17,000 stores, you will see that McDonald's is at saturation. If they added a store, it would probably cannibalize sales. So they aren't building a lot of new stores in the United States. They're looking at other countries. Japan probably is at about 3,500 stores right now. And China is probably at about 2,400 stores. It's hard to tell with China because they're adding a McDonald's in China probably about 2 or 3 every week. Starbucks this year is looking to add 1 new Starbucks in China basically every day. They're looking at 350 new Starbucks. This is where they see the growth potential. These are newly industrializing countries. It doesn't mean every person in that country can afford McDonald's, and heavens, they can't afford a $4 cup of coffee. And it actually is still pretty expensive in most of the developing countries. But they are expanding and doing well. If we look at the auto industry and what its rate of expansion is, this is a picture that is probably the way most of you imagine Chinese transportation to look. When I lived in China in 1999-2000, this is pretty much the way the streets of Beijing and Shanghai looked. And I was terrified to ride a bike. Obviously, I can ride a bicycle, but I was really scared to ride a bike because they ride very slowly. They ride for transportation. They don't ride for exercise. And they ride slowly, and they have this kind of, lolling rhythm. And I mean, if you just look how many bikes there are here. This is all that was on the main artery. This is the bike lane. Look how wide the bike lane is in those days. I was terrified. Like, what if I fell over back here? I would have knocked over like 10,000 people all at once. I could just see it on CCTV that night. White woman knocks over 10,000 bicyclists, on, I don't know, Hushanglu or something. And I'm like, I can't do that. So after about 3 or 4 months, I was actually okay riding. But if you came to China with me with a class, this is not what you would see today. This is what you would see. This is Chinese transportation today. And one of the scary things is they're all new drivers. Do you remember how awful it was when you were in high school? The most unsafe place in America to drive is a high school parking lot because everybody's a new driver. And the Chinese are all new drivers. Fortunately, they do not drive fast. In 1991, when I first went to China, there were actually only 150,000 cars, passenger cars in China, and virtually every single one of them was owned by the Communist Party. It came with a driver because you were a party official, or you were the guest of a party official, and gas pumps were at Communist Party headquarters. Now, they've had to change. They've had to change a lot. They've had to adapt their infrastructure, build parking structures, build gas stations, etc. And somewhere around 2010, China surpassed the United States in terms of the number of cars sold. Europe, in its total numbers, is still the largest market. The United States tends to, for the last, I don't know, probably 5 to 10 years, we have consumed about 10 to 12 million new cars every year. Now, the Chinese market is the bigger market. Every car manufacturer has a facility in China. The number of cars that can be produced in China right now is amazing. We can also look at something as simple as phone adoption. Again, the first time I went to China in 1991, only 5% of the population had ever made a phone call. Not owned a phone, had ever made a phone call. And the phones were giant red phones that were in communist-owned stores, and you'd have to go there and pay them a couple of pennies, and they would call another store and make a connection, and then they'd send a kid to run and get your relative who lived in the neighborhood, and they'd come down and talk to you on the phone. In other words, you just walked over and talked to someone. Today, the People's Republic of China has over 1 billion phones. India has almost 1 billion phones, and we in America have 327 million. If you look at what percentage of the population has a phone, for the PRC, that's about 75%. For the United States, that's about 103%. I give you Hong Kong, remember again, it is a special administrative region of China. It came back to China in 1997. And they have 187%. So if they're 9 million in population, they have somewhere on the order of 16.5 million phones. The Hong Kongers walk down the street literally with 2 phones and they're talking to themselves. Just think about the diffusion of cell phones. If you were a company like Samsung iPhone, even Nokia, Motorola, okay? Here's this poor Indian woman who has to walk probably a mile to the community well, fill this tub with this big pot with water, carry it home on her head, but she's using a cell phone while she does it. Here's a Chinese bride. I don't know, maybe she's updating her status on Facebook or WeChat. That's the Chinese version of Facebook. Facebook's not allowed. Or maybe she's just getting congratulations. Here are several Buddhist monks in Thailand. And here are even some Mongolian ladies. And Mongolia is pretty far behind in terms of economic development from India or China or Thailand. The market potential for these newly industrializing countries is phenomenal because the NICs tend to grow a lot faster than the DCs. In the NICs, we have a large growing middle class economy, and that's actually the thing you look for. You look for this burgeoning middle class economy. That's where, if you remember from your economics textbooks, remember you would see a spiral in the textbook and it would be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. What makes that spiral in the economy get bigger and bigger is that you have a middle class that's kind of self-fueling and it starts to grow on itself. If we just compare what the growth rates were for 2014, worldwide, about 4.5%. In the DCs, it's 2.6%, and that's largely driven by the United States having not a bad growth rate, an even better growth rate right now. Europe is a little slow, but the NICs, twice as fast. Okay, and China, for the last 11 years, it's been at least 9%. Some years, it's 12%. Just think about that compounded over a decade. Imagine if you got a job, you graduated and you had 2 job offers, and they're pretty much comparable jobs. And in one, they say, we're going to start you at $60,000 a year, but you're not going to get a raise for at least 15 years. And the other job says, we're going to start you at $52,000 a year, but we'll give you a 9% raise every year. Which job do you take? The same thing here. Which market do you look at? These are phenomenal. There is a concept called the BRICS, and the BRICS are important because all of these are countries that used to be closed to trade. The BRICS are the 4 biggest countries in terms of large populations, growing economies, and growing middle class. And it's pretty easy to remember: Brazil, Russia, used to be the Soviet Union, which was communist and closed, India, which had closed itself, as had Brazil, and China, which again, politically is still a communist nation, but economically is the most phenomenal market you've ever seen. We also sometimes zero in and talk specifically about the crouching tiger and the hidden dragon. India, which has more than 1.2 billion people and growing. And that, by the way, is kind of scary because geographically, India is 1/5 the size of China, and China's crowded. GDP per capita in India is growing, but it's not as good as it is in China. Both countries have huge, very, very poor people in the countryside, but they also have huge populations of middle-class people in the city. India alone has more than 400 million middle-class people. Now, there is one other category of countries, and this is a lot of countries. Okay, this is very large. The majority of countries are actually still LDCs. And for the most part, we're not looking to sell them cars. We're not looking to sell them refrigerators necessarily yet. They may not have that money because this is GDP per capita. But they can be good markets for little luxuries. And you remember what the little luxuries are. This could be candy. It could be cigarettes. It could be McDonald's. McDonald's, not the way that you and I might use McDonald's, where we go through the drive-thru and get the dollar menu because it's convenient, but they're doing it as a treat for the whole family. A company who has been amazingly successful, and it's hard for me to say this because they're a competitor of Hershey, but who is amazingly successful at targeting the LDCs is Nestle, the Swiss company. Nestle goes into a lot of LDCs and they bring their candy and they bring ice cream to countries that do not know ice cream. They bring ice cream and ice cream novelties, and they are amazingly successful, excellent at distribution. The fourth thing that we need to look at is the fact that if I were sending you abroad, if I ran a big company like Kraft Foods in 1970 and I said, you're going to go to Argentina and you're going to be the country manager. Well, I'm going to give you some money. I'm going to give you all the knowledge that you need. I'm going to give you all the experience that you need. And I'm going to say, if you have a problem, let me know. Of course, if you have a problem, you have to pretty much snail mail me back in Pittsburgh. No, that's Heinz. You're going to snail mail me back to headquarters in the United States. I'm going to write you a letter back. And by the time that second snail mail gets back, either the problem has blown up or you've solved the problem. What we used to have to do is pretty much send people on their own. Today, that's not the case. We have tremendous electronic interface between markets in a lot of different avenues. One is certainly in international finance. I mean, the global market economy could not be possible if we could not electronically wire money back and forth between countries, between companies, and even between consumers. So you and I can walk up to a Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation and you see the HSBC ATMs all over the world. You stick your ATM card in, and if you're in Russia, out come rubles. If you're in India, out come rupees. If you're in China, out come yuan. In the old days, you would actually have to, in your home country, in the United States, go to the bank, convert it to a traveler's check. Let's say I'm going to France in, I don't know, 1970. I would have to figure out how much money I needed. I'd go in and I'd get a $50 traveler's check, pay the bank $53. Then when I go to France, I'd have to go to a bank, which was only open a limited number of hours, and they would convert it and give me the equivalent in francs. It's a lot easier today. We can travel and we can exchange money. I show you a picture of this one. This one's at the university in Shanghai. We don't even have these in the United States. And this is a currency converter. You don't have to go and see a person. You don't have to go to a Cambio or an exchange. You walk up and you can put dollars, you could put you could put euros in, you could put yen in. I think it takes about 5 different currencies. And you pop in, you know, a couple of Andrew Jacksons or a couple of Ben Franklins in dollars, has to be all the same currency. And it will show you on the screen exactly what the exchange rate is at that minute to the 10th of a cent, and out pops your money. It's pretty amazing what we can do and how easily we can transfer money. We certainly have a lot of international travel, and that's for business. Huge numbers of people who are traveling abroad for business. We have it for pleasure. Many of you go abroad. I'm always trying to convince you to do that. And if you're not aware, San Diego State is really big on trying to convince people to do study abroads. For a large public university, we are second in the nation with a number of study abroad programs. And we like to encourage people to go for a semester, go for a year, because a lot of students can't afford the time or the money or just can't fit it in with their work schedule. We have a huge number of short-term faculty-led study abroad programs. We also have a lot of international communications. We don't have to just rely on that old snail mail. Think about what you can do when you sit down with Skype. I mean, the only real problem we still have, and we can't fix this one, is having to deal with time zones. So when I'm in China, I'm 15 hours ahead of you the next day. And I have to always kind of work out what time it is. When I am proctoring an exam with you or online with my students who are taking an exam in the morning in the United States, it's actually the wee small hours of tomorrow morning for me. And I am up talking to you guys. I show you these 2 pictures because I think this is kind of comical, of people who are living abroad for a while, not just short-term trips, but people who are maybe studying abroad or working abroad. Something like 1/20th of the time, the creature who is on the other end of the Skype is a pet. And we even have, if you watch Big Bang Theory, we even have cast members who we have, I don't think, ever seen live. We only ever see them on a Skype screen. That's a pretty amazing concept. One fourth element here, and here's where the United States has had a distinct advantage, is entertainment is very expensive to create. It's not cheap to make a movie. It's not even cheap to make a television show. So TV shows are often made in Britain and passed around the world, often made in Holland, and then passed around the world and kind of modified a little bit, but nothing is as big as Hollywood. And people around the world get to see our lifestyle for the good and the bad. They all seem to think we carry guns all the time. I'm always amazed at how my Chinese colleagues and Chinese students seem to think that I'm like packing one when I'm in America. And I look at them and go, seriously, do you really think that? But they do get to see how we live. So for product placement, which we'll talk about when we get to the IMC section at the end of the term, think how valuable it is to pay to put your product in a movie or in a TV show. Starbucks does very little advertising, but they spend money on product placement, because if they place their coffees, their coffee shops in a movie, and that they haven't even gone to that country yet, people see it and they're watching people walking around carrying their cup of Starbucks like it's the greatest thing in the world, like they're carrying a pot of gold. And then when Starbucks opens in that country, they already have sort of a preconceived idea of what it is. Just as a point of reference, in case you don't know, there is one place that actually produces more movies, a larger number of movies than we do, and that is Bollywood. The problem is they're kind of distinct movies. Most of those of you who've seen a Bollywood movie or seen a lot of Bollywood movies would probably admit there's about 5 female actors, 5 male actors, 4 scripts, and a lot of music. If you remember from Slumdog Millionaire, at the very end of that movie, they were all on the train platform doing their little Bollywood dance, and that was actually kind of a thank you to Bollywood, because most of the movie was filmed in the United States, but they had to use some of the Bollywood studios for parts of it. If you've never seen one, they're kind of crazy, and consequently, most of us don't watch them the same way we would someplace else.